Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. My name is Sean. I'll be your host. Hello. Thank you for your kind greeting. Please, if you would, silence your cell phones at this time and other devices, whatever it is you carry around. And if you would like a copy of the second printing of the new Upper Ohio Valley Historical Review, they are available for $10. There are 6 left. Next week on July 1st, how do you like the new furniture, by the way? You like it? Well, if you don't like it, too bad. There's nothing I can do. The other furniture was here for 50 plus years, so. All right, let's come to order now, please. Come to order. Thank you. Next week on the 1st July, it's the 1st of July already in a week, Professor William Kerrigan will be here. His book is called West Virginia's War, and it is about the state, the only state born of the Civil War, our state. And he's from Ohio, so we'll see what he has to say. On July 8th at noon, the Wheeling Poetry Series presents C.J. Farnsworth and Frank Leonard. The person we were going to have has a medical issue, so that Mark scheduled C.J. and Frank, and they are excellent, and they will be here on July 8th. Today, we're going to talk about Dysart Woods. Jacqueline Yahn is an associate professor of teacher education at The Ohio University, teaching regional higher education students across 5 campuses. Her research centers on rural school and community vitality, with a strong focus on the unique challenges and opportunities within the Appalachian region, particularly regarding school funding and education policy. She and her husband, Chris, are proud to raise their son, Liam, in the Ohio Valley, surrounded by 3 generations of their family. Please welcome Jacqueline Yahn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'll start with saying one of my favorite artists, Austin Kleon, he talks about this idea of show your work. And what he means is days like today, where you get to interact with audiences that are interested in what you research or what you create and what you do. And for me, that's the most fun when it's in my local community, which takes me to my second thank you. The Ohio County Public Library is my local library. My son, Liam, that's back there, is a beneficiary of many of their children's programs. I check out books here weekly if I have one overdue. I'm sorry, because that's common for me. And I've attended many wonderful, as I was talking with this table over here earlier, wonderful programs here at the library over the years. So it's a real pleasure to get to add my name to that list of folks that have presented here. So a final thank you that I want to give as I start is to Captina Conservancy. They are my community partner in the work I do at Dysart in every sense of the word. If you are not familiar with Captina, in a nutshell or an elevator pitch, their mission is to promote and preserve the biodiversity and natural beauty of the Captina Creek watershed, which Dysart Woods is a part of, and other watersheds in the region. And when I say that they are my community partner, I really want to visualize for you what that means. It means that they provide the space and access to archives they have related to Dysart right on site at their offices in Barnesville. It means they come out on the trails with me and lead groups of my students at Ohio University on hikes and in other environmental education programming. And they sometimes come to things like this with me, and we talk and co-lead together. That's Marshall, their land conservation manager. So I also spread out a few brochures and things I had on hand about them. They have a really great website and Facebook, so please check them out. Land conservation manager. So I also spread out I say that they are my okay, so as we get started today, probably something you should know about me professionally and as a person, my husband will say I'm a just put your boots on sort of person in the very literal sense of I want to be out in the woods or out in my classroom teaching and out doing the work or at my computer writing up the fun data or things I've discovered. And that's kind of, I like to jump right to that. And this was brought to my attention the other day. I was meeting with community partner Rural Action in Athens, Ohio. And our group has worked together for years and years and years, but their environmental ed director is new. And I turned to him and I said, Jamie, what's your 5-year, what's your data collection plan? What are your want list, your ambitions? And everybody joked and said, it's echoing. Do you want me to do this? Am I loud enough? Yes. Okay. Can I turn this off? Yeah. Okay, so is there a way I can keep it from echoing? If I do this. This. Just put your boots on. Are we okay? Okay. I'm going to try my best. I have a loud voice to begin with, but I'm going to try to step back. Okay, I can do that. Okay. So that's a really good segue because that's what I mean. I like to get right to the work. And today, what I'm going to do is really try to vicariously take you through some key spots at Dysart Woods and some key hiking spots. But to do that, before we put our boots on, I think it's really helpful to give you some background information on Dysart. So I want to slow down and do that. If you are not familiar with Dysart Woods, it sits between Belmont, Ohio and Centerville, Ohio. And when you go to Dysart Woods, you're going to 2 tracts of old growth forest, because Dysart Woods has a red trail and a blue trail, and I'll talk about both of those today. What makes Dysart Woods exceptional, not just to us here in our local community in the Ohio Valley, but throughout Appalachia and most of eastern Ohio, is it is one of the last tracts of old growth forest in all of the eastern United States. And what that means is not just that it hasn't been timbered, but also that it has trees whose lifetime is somewhere between 400 and 500 years old now. It means that it has an understory and so your understory is, your ground, your dirt, your soil, your watershed, different plants and vegetation. And think of somewhere else maybe you've hiked here in our local area or throughout Appalachia. You're typically hiking through a second growth forest. And those are typically managed by humans and foresters, and old growth forests have a whole different, they're not managed in that way. What you're looking at is what most of Belmont County, most of this part of the area, most of the Ohio Valley looked like pre-settlement, but you're seeing it in just these 2 remaining tracts of about 50 acres at Dysart Woods. But the second thing I want to explain to people is when you go to Dysart Woods, you're actually surrounded by about 450 or so acres of what was once a working farm. And that working farm was passed down for 5 generations by the Dysart family. And I'll weave that story in today. But that working landscape, so this is about what the farm looked like in about 1959, 1960, right before Dysart Woods came to be what we know it now. So this was as the last generation was living on the farm. And one of the things I try to explain to people is it's not just these 50 acres of wood and old growth that's important. It's this whole 450-acre farm that this family stewarded, and the way they steward it that allows Dysart Woods to exist and be conserved and us enjoy it the way we do today. Because this is one of the maps you'll see over and over again in archives and current work on Dysart, When Dysart came to be, if you look at those two little tracks in the middle and you see the key up here at the top, that's the old growth forest tracks. Then you look at the kind of little stars surrounding it. That's second growth forest that was cut over and went to regrowth. That becomes really important to forming what's called a buffer zone. And that buffer zone does things like provides a windbreak. And we'll talk about why that matters to old growth forest. So the story of Dysart is not just the old growth tracts. It's a decision by a family for 5 generations of how they stewarded that land, and it's a decision about how they passed that land over to the Nature Conservancy and Ohio University, and now Captina stewards it today. So again, as I start to talk about Dysart, I like to show some pictures to really engage you. These are the types of trees that folks come to see, these behemoth old growth trees, and I'll talk about those a lot. And sometimes people ask me what are some of the prominent trees right now. 2 prominent ones right now are maple and beech, amongst others. But again, a big part of the story is the understory as well. What happens with the watershed, what happens with the old growth management when we leave a log down or leave a tree down once it falls, and why that matters to things like soil quality and watershed quality. So it's a bigger picture story. All right, family, sorry, you're up. My family's in the back today. So another part of my story and my work with Dysart starts with that my grandparents, Bill and Bernice Bartles, when the Nature Conservancy approached Ohio University to take over stewardship, my grandfather, Bill Bartles, agreed to become the caretaker and live in the residence on the property and move my dad and his 3 siblings into that residence. And they started that work in 1968. My grandfather passed away in 1984, and my grandmother continued that work till 1994. So in my earliest years, I was born in 1985, so it gives you an idea of how old I am. In my earliest years, and my brother and my 4 cousins' earliest years, our grandma had a virgin forest, and old growth forest is her backyard. University presidents and board of trustee members and folks came up to research, and that was just normal life to us. And then in 1994, my aunt and uncle, Mitch and Ann Bartles, so Mitch is my dad's older brother, they decided that they were willing to move in when my grandmother moved out and continued to steward the woods until 2004. And so that took me through my adolescent years into right when I graduated high school. And that was really formative for me over those years of the research trajectory that Sean talked about. That's how it came to be, particularly because what's really well known from the 90s and 2000 in the early 2000s is that Ohio University and Ohio Valley Coal had a back and forth battle about whether or not the woods could be longwall mined under. And I will share some of that history in my talk today, but I give you a preview of it now, because that's when I started asking the types of questions that lead to my research. And I don't hyperbolize that. Back in 2017, when I finished my own dissertation, I wrote a little thank you to my grandmother because I really thought that what she and my grandfather were willing to do with being caretakers, and then my aunt and uncle and my entire family, really inspired the research I do today. So there was a break in my own life from 2004. I went off to college to about 2021, where we were not deeply engaged with the woods. It had new caretakers. There were a lot of transitions at Ohio University at that time. But for a number of reasons, in about 2021, I came back to starting to engage with the woods. And one of them is, I'm going to retell how Captina's executive director, Ellie, told this story last Friday to my students, because I think it's a really great way to explain it. So Ellie explained to my students last Friday, think about 2021 and what's happening for universities around the US. Major financial disruptions, right? Universities have historically owned, especially state universities, different properties in the state for various purposes. They can be purposes like Dysart Woods for research, conservation, classroom activity. They can be all different types of reasons. Well, at that time, OU wasn't unlike a lot of its peers, where it had to start to divest in some of its properties because they still weren't sure what the financial future was going to be, so one of the strategies was to start to divest. Another problem OU was facing is they didn't have a local caretaker from the university anymore, like what my family did that was directly affiliated with the university. And so as Ellie tells it, the minute that news hit the press, her phone started to ring. Because if you think back to what I shared about Captina, that's the work they do. And so what's beautiful about Captina is that they could take over the same responsibilities as OU and be that localized caretaking stewardship responsibility. And so Ellie tells that story, and there was a series of steps with grants and work. But in 2023, and many of you may have seen these articles because they did a really nice job covering it in the press, Captina officially took stewardship. And at that time, my work with Captina really started to pick up for a number of reasons. The first reason it started to pick up is because I became aware of all these archives that were available on not just the natural history of Dysart Woods, but the history with the coal mining battles and some of the human history and how Dysart Woods even came to be. And I found out there was a lot of history about folks, like some of you might remember the naturalist George Briding, who worked at the Schrader Center at Oglebay Park, that there's a lot of history about folks like that who were integral and bringing Dysart Woods to fruition. And so I became interested in how can we retell that history and bring it back to life. And I've also had the opportunity to be approached by lots of folks who have oral histories and are willing to share those with me. So I started to want to do research on the woods, but I also wanted to bring back Ohio University students and students from other universities being out at the woods and actively engaging. Because if you talk to Marshall, if you ever go on one of the guided hikes and you talk to Marshall, the land grant manager, one of their goals is to engage the youth and to engage families and keep generations excited and interested in the woods. And so another piece of the work I do with Captina is through my own classes and work at OU, bringing folks out. So for example, that class up there is about 16 students from our Athens and our Southern campus that came up for a field trip this spring. And so I'm going to pause here and say, so this work is really fun, but sometimes you can talk about it can sound a little glamorous, so I just want to humble myself and bring myself back down to reality. It also involves things like when you're pulling out a campus one day going, we're going to need a porta potty because we don't have any restrooms on site. And so who's already approved by OU? Okay, we'll call them. And it involves days when you're doing your research and I'm not a social media influencer. I don't even have social media, so why did I take this selfie? To remind myself that I had just scanned 100 documents from Captina's archive and the upload had failed and I had lost my entire scan. So I took that picture as a humble reminder that research is a lot of grunt work as well. Okay, so now for the fun part. We are going to, in our imaginations, put our boots on. And what I mean by that is I'm going to take you to some of our favorite spots, our being myself and Captina, when we take Ohio University students out to the woods. These are some of the spots we take them to get them excited, to get them to want to come back, to get them to think about as future teachers or working in jobs like Marshall himself works in, of wanting to do this type of work, but also bring the community along for the ride. So the first spot I'm going to take you to is the parking lot. And you're like, wow, Yahn, that was a really big build-up for a really boring start. No, I promise it's not. Promise it's not. Okay, so when you go out to Dysart Woods and you go to the parking lot, which if you travel out there, it's going to be about 3/4 of a mile down that dirt road on your left after you see the Dysart signs. So when you get to the parking lot, you can enter either the red or the blue trail. And I'll talk about both trails today. And either trail you choose to do, if you chose to do the red trail, I'll show you at the end of the presentation. But when you come out at the end of that trail, you can loop right onto the blue trail, and that'll take you back to the parking lot. Or you could, if you say this was enough for me, you could walk back down the road to the parking lot. But when we go out to this trailhead in the parking lot, it's a great opportunity for us to talk to students about how Dysart came to be, because it's really easy to lose that history. wow, this old growth forest exists in Belmont County and I didn't know it, and okay, let's go hike it. And it's easy to miss a really important part of our local history that many of our students at OU and some of the community don't know. So what we do, Marshall and I, depending on the season, will either walk them right along the road and say, kind of look down into the blue trail, or we'll stand them at the trailhead of the red trail. Or if we just had a group out there on Friday, and as you know, like it's thick, the canopy's thick right now because we're in the throes of summer. If you don't know we're in the throes of summer, just step outside. So if we're in the throes of summer, we'll say, you're about to feel this because you're going to walk down and it's going to be a big descent, and then you're going to start climbing hills and you're really going to feel it. What we're trying to bring to their attention is when the Dysart farm was settled in 1813 by Miles Hart, the first member of the family to settle it, it was sheer practicality that this piece wasn't timbered. Because of the steepness of the terrain, because of the local topography, that is originally why it was left alone. And if students look and go, oh, yeah, okay, Dr. Yahn, whatever, we can take them back into that parking lot and we can walk them just back behind the parking spaces and we can show them the foundation of one of the barns that was on that piece of the property. So we can really make it real. Right here, here was a barn, there were fields back behind here, really make it visible and real, and talk to them that the first piece of this was practicality. But then it became intentional. And we know it became intentional because Gladys and Margaret Dysart, the two sisters you hear about who inherited the farm from their uncle O.B., and worked with John Kinder, the local attorney who helped them work with the Nature Conservancy and make the initial transfer that brought us to what Dysart Woods is today. Gladys was a wonderful record keeper of her family's history, and she was very generous with sharing it. She would share it in historical records in Belmont County, so you can find them if you go up to the Wheeling Room and you look at the Belmont County history books. You can read some of the history of the Dysart family. She shared it with Ohio University graduate students. So if you look at a thesis or dissertation from the 60s or 70s, and the graduate students write the background of the Dysart farm, you'll see that they're citing personal communication with Gladys. So she was really generous with sharing it. And one of my favorite stories to tell students out on the trail to make this real, here's how it became intentional. She also talked a lot with my grandfather. They became friends. And she'd tell him tidbits that he could share with people when they were coming to visit the woods. And so eventually he retold one of those stories into the written record in a famous magazine article about Dysart. And she told him, you know, as my uncle was getting older, he continued to be reapproached by the timber companies, but our family had always kind of loved that tract of land, and some of us had hiked down there, and we loved the land. The Dysart family weren't just responsible farmers, they were teachers, and they were also very responsible with their finances, so they had enough to live and live well, but they didn't prioritize living in a grandiose way. And so she said her uncle came to her and said, you know, what do you think I should do about that? You know, something along the lines of, the timber company's approaching me again, what do you think I should do? And she knew how to get him. The way my grandfather retold the story, she knew how to just kind of rile him up like we do in families. And she said, well, do you need the money? And the way she told it to Grandpa was like, no, I don't need that money. And so I don't know, we'll never know if she said it exactly this way, but I like to think she said it this way or close. But the way Grandpa retold it when he did a few interviews is, she said, well, then just leave it alone. And I really like to think of Gladys Dysart's, one of her first initiatives being, hey, just leave it alone. And one of the reasons this is so incredible, so you all know, we're all from the Ohio Valley, so you know the view you're looking at the Ohio and West Virginia side of the river. We're a working landscape, agriculturally, through natural resource extraction, through manufacturing on the river. So when you think about Gladys and Margaret suggesting leave it alone, and then later making the decision to sell the family farm, the 450 acres they inherited, and the old growth tract so it could be conserved, to quote my Aunt Martha, that was a pretty radical decision at that time. And we owe them a debt of gratitude as the local community. and to just really hammer home. People hear sell, they'll say, well, I thought they just donated it. They basically did, folks. They sold the 450 acres so it could form the buffer and the caretaker residence and all that Dysart Woods came to be and the old growth for $50,000 at the time. That was less than what the timber was worth at that time. And so this is a picture from one of our local newspapers on the day they did the sale. Over here is a little note from Margaret. So Margaret, Gladys' sister, continued to donate to the Dysart Woods Fund for years and years and years. I keep finding notes and marks of her donations in the records. They really wanted this place to exist how it is. So I love to take students to that first spot and slow down and recognize the Dysart family at large and 5 generations of stewardship, but Margaret and Gladys for that really just monumental decision for our community. And if we think, well, they just, sometimes we think, well, of course people write nice things about themselves. Just yesterday when I was at OU's archives, I found a letter from Sarah, who was, in the letter she explains that Gladys was her sister-in-law, and here's a quote I pulled out that she wrote to OU's president. They were humble, thrifty, hardworking people who loved the land. And those are the really fun finds in the archives. So the second spot I want to take you to is on the Blue Trail. So we're going to go over to the Blue Trail. This trail is on the parking lot side of the trail. If you want the gentler of the two trails, this is a great trail, but you're still going to see, and as I'm going to explain here as I talk about the Blue Loop, you're going to really see ecologically what makes Dysart magnificent, but also I think really enjoy your hike. So as you walk into the Blue Trail, I don't know, Dad, how far down would you say is the start of the Blue Loop? Yes. How far down would you say anybody in the Bartles family the Blue Loop is? About how far of a walk can folks expect? Yes. This will be on the test. No, Dad, how far to the Blue Loop from the start of the trailhead? Yes. Okay, so about half a mile. Thank you. Former social studies teacher there, all. Okay, so when you start on the Blue Trail, I just wanted to give you about an approximate distance. As my dad said, about a half a mile down, you're going to hit a sign that says you can keep going left on the Blue Trail or you can do a loop. Do the loop. The loop will come back and you can finish the trail, and you'll still, depending on how fast or slow you walk, spend about 40, 50 minutes. You could spend longer if you wanted. But the Blue Loop is going to show you what's so magnificent about Dysart. And so Marshall and I had a group of students on the Blue Loop just last Friday, and something he said to them is, one of the things that's really neat about the Blue Trail is if you think back to that map I showed you early on that I said is consequential, you realize when you look at that map that the Blue Trail has a buffer zone that almost entirely encompasses it. So it provides a windbreak, and it's provided for some of the threats on the Red Trail with wind and things that take down some of the old growth and things. The Blue Trail is more buffered from that, and so it's really helped maintain its ecological importance. So a few things about the Blue Trail that really help you think about Dysart in a bigger way is that everybody wants to look up at the canopy and do that. When I'm taking students, I'm always like, look up, look up, look up, and getting them to slow down. Because when you're looking up, you're seeing what happens. You're seeing which types of trees dominate the canopy. You're seeing how you can see thinner little trees like this, and you might think they're just very young, 5, 10 years old, but as we'll explain, they could be much older and waiting for their chance for an older tree to fall and to hit that canopy and that sunlight. So those trees could have been waiting for much longer than we realize. You can also learn things about Brian McCarthy, botanist at OU, was starting a study back in 1997 when oaks were starting to die off in the eastern United States, and he was explaining going to an old-growth forest is sort of the canary in the coal mine because you're getting a sense of what this is going to mean on a bigger scale. But I also tell people on the Blue Loop, and this is all thanks to my little guy and my favorite research assistant, my son Liam, who's back there. Can't miss him because he's wearing his OU gear today. Liam is really good at reminding us to look at the understory and the floor of the forest and looking at things like that log behind him, which is part of a tree that's fallen. And part of old growth management is to leave it where it is and let it naturally decompose. And as Marshall did for my students the other day, he just scooped up some dirt and he talked about how this dirt and this old growth track is different than dirt when you would go up, say, close to the farmhouse because of the way we manage old growth forests. So it's a really great way to see what Dysart has to offer. I also put one of the pictures from my accidental spring wildflower hike, and what I mean by that is different seasons in Dysart, you'll see different things related to that season. So it's also a loop that if you went to it each of the 4 seasons, you'd see different unique things. Just to bring this home one more time, I'm going to pull another one of my favorite things from the archives. So in the early days of Dysart, after the Dysart family and their attorney and the local group that organized started working with the Nature Conservancy, a big piece of the lift had to be to convince the Nature Conservancy that the purchase was worth it, because $50,000 is still a lot to a nonprofit. And there's the long-term management, right? You're getting 50 acres of old growth, and you're getting a 450-acre tract of land that has to be managed. And so what you see in the archives, particularly the ones I work with at Captina, are all these letters back and forth amongst scientists, so people that work in botany, forestry, biology, having different opinions about its ecological value. And one of my favorites is from Dr. Willard Carmen, who was the head of the Natural Areas Committee for Ohio's chapter of the Nature Conservancy, because in this letter, the whole letter is about 3 pages, he's arguing back and forth with a forester at WVU who he's friends with, but he's arguing back and forth about the value of Dysart, and they see it 2 different ways. And so it's really fun to hear that argument. But what I particularly love is that you see this little, in quotes here, where he calls it the last passenger pigeon. Well, this was a little like scientist to scientist jab, because we as humans are responsible for the very quick extinction of the passenger pigeon. And so he was using that kind of with a double meaning to say, here's Dysart's value, but also to just, I think there's a little scientific back and forth jab, which is fun to think about. One final thing I'll point about to maybe encourage you to go on to the Blue Loop is when I had my students out there last week, we did an activity on the Blue Loop. They were making something called event maps, which is a form of nature journaling for larger projects they're involved in. And my student Emma from the Zanesville campus was working with my son Liam, and Liam really got Emma sold on the value of the understory. He's like, don't look up, Emma, look at all these cool things on the ground. Right, Liam? Yep. And when we were drawing out the event maps later, Emma talked about how paying such close attention to the forest floor was how she understood that concept of what was valuable about Gladys making that comment, just leave it alone. And so I thought that was a pretty neat full circle moment that you can't plan as a professor. You could do that activity 10 other times and they wouldn't make that connection, but it was really fun. And I asked her, I said, can I share this in my talk? And she said yes. Okay, so let's go to another stop. This is my personal favorite. So we all have our biases. This is my personal favorite. If you have been to Dysart, I'm taking you over to the other trail. I'm taking you to, you can see why it's my favorite, right? I don't even have to say the quote yet, and you're laughing. So on the red trail, you're going to go down not even a quarter of a mile. You're going to go down into a descent, and you're going to know you're there because you're going to see this sign, but you're also going to be standing and looking out at a working farm. So the sign you're going to see is for Trails End Farm. It's going to say, do not cross this field unless you can do it in 9 seconds, because the bull can do it in 10. This is not, for you TikTokers out there, a challenge. This is real. So this is not a challenge. They are serious. The they is the Dunphy family. They've been longtime friends with our family, and they are also generational stewards of their land. So one, the students laugh. They love to take pictures in front of this sign. It's a great place to pause, and I'll show you here in this upcoming picture. You can really, there's places to stand, and we can have a talk. But what I really like about this place is I can make real a few key things we want them to take away. The first is we can tell them to look out at the Dunphy farm, and we can talk about what it means to be in a working landscape. And we can talk about the history of that family passing that farm down. We can talk about the struggles the area has faced with things like the years of longwall mining. We can talk about the fracking that's going on now, which can be very controversial. There's all different views in our community about fracking. And then we can say things like, okay, right where you're standing atop what was once the number 6 mine. You're standing atop what was the number 8 coal seam, which is one of the most prosperous coal seams in all of the United States, because in Belmont County, we were the number 1 producer ever in Ohio of coal. So you can make it real very quickly. And you can say, but look behind you, and you have tracts of old growth, and you are on conserved land. And then we can have a very real talk about what is called rural environmentalism, which is not the type of environmentalism that's going to make the splashy papers on the news or news stories, but it's what most of us in this room have lived in some capacity. This careful balance between what it means to pass down land generationally, what it means to conserve pieces of land, and what it means for it to coexist. And part of that is a deep knowledge of what's happening on the land, passed down generation over generation over generation. And as I'll tell you in our last stop, that rural environmentalism plays a key piece in Dysart's past and in what became its future. So it played a key piece in Dysart's past because it was a large part of the inspiration for the Dysart family and the local community that joined with them to make that initial transition to OU possible, of seeing they knew the value locally of that land because they knew how unique those tracts of old growth were compared to what else was left in Belmont County. And they knew the histories of how that happened because it's their family histories. So that's a key part in that initial conservation of Dysart. It's also a key part for the initial director of Dysart, Dr. Warren Wistendahl at Ohio University, because what folks don't realize, he was ahead of his time. Nobody was thinking yet about conserving old growth out in the Pacific Northwest. Today we think of old growth and we think of the Pacific Northwest, the spotted owl ruling, the environmental acts that went in during the Clinton administration. None of that was happening yet. And Dr. Wistendahl and his team knew when they went down there, and you can see some of the first pictures sitting on the table up here, they knew the ecological value of what they were looking at and why it was worth studying, why it was worth having graduate students study, bringing classes there. And so this is a key part of Dysart's past, but it becomes a key part of Dysart's future. Because when we get to the battles that happen with Ohio Valley Coal, one of the things we have to realize is at the local level, people sharing what they were concerned about happening with watersheds on their land and changes on their land is what makes visible we could have a real problem here. So the final stop that I'll take you to and that I often take students to is a piece of, I like to pick, there's multiple places you can pick on the trail. I picked this small waterfall place just because if you were to go hike there yourself, you'll remember it. You'll easily be able to see it from the trail and you'll remember it. But there's multiple places where you can think about the watershed on the Red Trail. What I also like about this spot is nearby is some of the water monitoring equipment that you would see throughout the whole woods, which is how Ohio University monitors what's going on with the water tables since coal mining has happened in this area. So I like to take students here to talk to them because when you try to make visible to folks why there was such an intensive battle over longwall coal mining, one, you have to make visible the difference between Ohio University owning the surface rights and Dysart the property versus the coal company inheriting through their earlier purchases of those coal rights. And two, you have to make visible what was at stake. And it's the watershed and the water table beneath the trees that's at stake, but that's very hard for people to visualize of what we're talking about. It's also hard to visualize how would you research that. So I really like to take them to a live research site. And what we talk about at this site is that the battles with Ohio Valley Coal actually go back much longer than when they made the press. They start as early as 1970. Ohio Valley Coal wasn't Ohio Valley Coal yet. It was an earlier version of that coal company. But as early as 1970, Ohio University starts trying to ward off threats, first of strip mining near the buffer zone, and then later in the 1980s, first room and pillar mining, and then longwall mining. And when we get to the longwall mining years, which if you have ever read through those articles in the local press are often the ones people remember the most, this is what becomes the battle. And I'll show you over here, this map here comes from a study of 2 OU graduate students. And if you see those tracks in red or in green, and you see that little piece in red, you're seeing what was the eventual settlement here, which was a decision to room and pillar mine under the woods and longwall mine around it. And you're also seeing a piece of the ongoing research. But I will briefly talk about it now and let folks ask me questions in the Q&A if this is one of the things that are interesting. But when you get into the archives, particularly the ones from Ohio University, you're looking at archives from the president, you're looking at archives from his legal counsel, and so what you're seeing is the very intensive back and forth between a coal company, a university, and local landowners who all have something at stake. And what they have at stake is their water tables. And what you realize is there are no saints and villains in this story. There are a lot of people with moving parts, and so it's really interesting to see all the different tensions that come up. But the piece I like to tell people is, again, back to that rural environmentalism, how important the surrounding farms were to saying, this is not just going to disrupt the old growth trees, this is going to disrupt our water tables, our water sources on our farms, and what we have worked to pass down. And I think this piece often gets lost in the story. We hear about OU's activism, and we hear about activism of OU graduate students and different environmental groups, but we often miss the activism of local folks, and that was some of the strongest pieces of activism. But I'll just leave you with a fun story from the archives on this one. It's sitting up there. It's called The Hawking Voice, and it's a little 12-page, I think, handbook that was put together by one of the activist groups called the Dysart Defenders. And right in the middle of it is a little anecdotal story about OU researchers, students from Ohio University that were part of Dysart Defenders, and coal company researchers all accidentally meeting on the trail one day, and they're back and forth. But my favorite part is that the argument ended with somebody from the coal company research team saying, well, what are you going to quote? And I thought, well, that's a salient piece of that anecdote, because even today we think about what are you going to quote and how is this going to play out? Whoops. So the last piece I want to come back to, and I'm going to open it up for questions, because honestly, some of the most interesting things to talk about Dysart is the questions folks have and specific things I can answer for you or tell you more about. But I've been writing some pieces in addition to doing talks and things to get some information about. I particularly want Gladys and Margaret's story out there, so I'm working on an article about the two of them right now. And one of my pieces I'm writing, in fact, the one about them, I end it with this piece, and I borrow from, if you've never read this book, think about it, Elizabeth Katz's What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia. It's a great little book. So if you've never read it, plug for that book. But I end it with saying, what is so beautiful about Dysart Woods for our community here in the Ohio Valley, and I think as a landmark in Appalachia at large, is it's a place where you can go, to borrow from Elizabeth Katz's wording, where you can get Appalachia a little less wrong. And we owe a debt of gratitude to the Dysart family and to the local folks over the generations and who continue to do the work, and now Captina today, to seeing that value. And I really love taking my students out there and helping them rethink what they can be proud about at their own communities. So I'm going to open it up for questions, but I'm going to say, if there's something you want access to or want to talk to me about or want more about, that's my OU email. If you email me, I will respond. If you're sitting here thinking, I have a story about Dysart, and you're willing to share it, I would love to collect that as a piece of the oral history that's weaving into my work. So I'll leave that up here. I'm going to flip to a second slide because I promised I'd tell you about the crossroads, but the email address is still on this final slide. And so as I open it up to questions, I'll just say again, if you start either of the trails, when you come out on either the blue or red trail, you have the opportunity to cross over to the other one. It's called the Crossroads, and make a full loop and back to the Dysart parking lot, or you could head back down. But the Crossroads is where I usually stop with my students and other groups and say, what questions do you have? So I'll do that now. Even the mics have had enough of the heat today. They're like,
Okay. I think we're good now. First, we had an online question from a viewer. Are there bears in these woods?
Okay, so Marshall Dyer, who's the land grant manager, this is one of the pieces I have him talk to my students about, because we think a lot about the trees, and it's really easy to think about the insects and some of the smaller animals. And so historically, we know from our family, and we know from what we know about Belmont County, that black bears occasionally have passed through these woods. To our knowledge, Captina has a trail cam, so we haven't been seeing a bear on the trail cam lately or things like that, but we know historically bears have passed through and will again. Have any of us recently encountered one on the trail? No. We do have a bobcat. She's been caught on the trail cam a couple times, much to my son Liam's disappointment, though the trail cam footage accidentally got deleted. So Marshall keeps going through footage and trying to find another one. So right now we do have a bobcat out there.
So how well visited is the woods?
So I'm going to talk historically, and I'm going to talk now, and I'm going to talk. So historically, we know at one time there were about 5,000 to 6,000 visitors a year. So in the late 60s, when Dysart Woods is open to the public, 70s, 80s, and we know that because the records were kept through a guest book. My dad and his siblings and my grandparents often that was my grandpa's big thing, is having people sign in the guest book. And we know that those visitors came from all over the U.S., and many of them were research teams all over the U.S. or just folks interested in what they'd heard about Dysart. So Captina's trying to find some different ways to know now. One way is they have a counter under a tree that can basically count how many people enter each of the trails. The only trick is they're not sure how often a deer is accidentally triggering it. What they do know is they're seeing on their hikes, so they do a guided hike first Sunday of every month. You can learn about it on their social medias, and if you want to go but don't want to go by yourself, this is a great opportunity. So they know they're seeing 15 to 20 folks just come to those. My son Liam and I are out a lot for research and other work. Every time we're out there, we at least pass 3-4 other groups on the trails. So we know that the visitor count is going up. They're still trying to figure out how to maybe get a more accurate number. So again, go out and visit it, and you can add to that number. And the trails are really well kept. That's the other thing I want to say.
That was my question. So are the trails maintained as far as old trees won't fall across the trail, trails are cleared up?
This is a great question, and it's something Marshall and Ellie asked me to share. So when stewardship transitioned from Ohio University to Captina in 2023, this is one of the things Captina immediately focused on, because it was one of the things that had declined a little bit, just for a number of reasons. They are very well kept, they are very well marked. You are in old growth forest, so I do recommend, when I was there last Friday, we had long pants, long sleeves on, because you are in old growth, so there's going to be, things like poison ivy, there are going to be things, but the trails are easy to walk and maintained. And you had a second question there about the... Yeah, so here's what Marshall, there have been different theories on this over the years with old growth management. The management Marshall's currently following is he'll cut enough so that you could get through the path, but otherwise leave the tree be. So you're going to see all those different fallen trees. That's a key part of the health of the woods, but he'll do enough so that you can get through because they want people to be able to visit it.
Are there any Dysart descendants?
Yeah, so this is something I'm working on. I'll say if anybody in the room also wants to share. So my cousin Sarah recently had an exchange. Gladys's son still lives, I believe, here in the Wheeling area, and I'm really hoping to talk to him because I would like to quote him in the article. We also have a few members of the family. So my cousin Sarah bought the Dysart homestead, that the caretaker residence that OU owned. When OU and Captina changed the property, they divested of the caretaker residence, and Sarah bought it and is restoring it. So there was an article run in the paper about that, and what's been really neat is some other descendants of the family have reached out with memories, pictures, and hopefully a willingness to share some histories that can be added. And just one thing, I don't want to go on and on, but I want to say, if you look up, for example, Gladys and who she was as a person, her civic footprint in this valley was nothing short of amazing, and it was a very humble footprint. She was on things like FFA, things like, she was very involved in the community, and she continued to speak and assist with Dysart until the day she died. She would come out and help the university and other entities with events. So I really want to say they were a huge part, not just of the transition of the land, but then people getting excited about it after.
Any other questions? We do have another question.
Is the coal company still active in that area?
Not under Dysart. So I will spare you if you want to talk to me individually. So a whole other part of my work, I do a lot of research work on coal and oil and gas. So I'm not going to take you down the huge rabbit hole if you want to talk to me individually. But just a brief blip of that, Ohio's coal industry dropped off precipitously in the early 2000s. One, because our coal is harder to clean than some of the other available resources of coal. Two, because of different acts in Congress that made it harder to sell. And three, quite frankly, because of the intensive mining that had already happened. So all of the area around Dysart virtually has been longwalled or room and pillar mined under, but is no longer an active mining site.
Anybody else? Okay, one moment.
Say that again.
I'm getting there. Here you go.
How does fracking, is it a problem for you?
So this is a wonderful and kind of fortuitous piece of the story. So when oil and gas activity started to really bubble up in the area, Ohio University at large did a survey of all of its alumni and got a gauge of alumni, donors, how folks would feel about leasing rights for fracking, and they did not feel amicable towards it. So at that time, they did not lease the rights to frack around Dysart. So there are oil and gas wells out in that area. There's quite heavy oil and gas activity in the Belmont to Centerville area at large, but there is not oil and gas activity on Dysart or any part of that 450-acre farm. Dad, take note. Look how well Dr. Lash, she was paying attention.
Of course I have a
Thank you for being a good example for him.
Well, it is about your students that you take out there. Are they going to be social studies teachers, or what is their background, and what do they make of these field trips and the learning experience that you give them?
So that's a great question. So I am I'm an associate professor of teacher education at OU. So the vast amount of courses I teach, my students are going to be elementary and middle school teachers. And as Dr. Lash knows, I also teach several courses specifically in social studies. So there's two answers to your question. I also teach a course for Ohio University's Honors Tutorial College, and what's really neat with that course is the students are from all different majors across the university. So you can imagine that field trip is geared a different way than the field trips for my students in education. So the students you saw that I just had out there a couple days ago, they are part of a larger program called the Rural Teacher Corps for undergraduate students, and they will all be middle and elementary teachers in different subjects, and their work is focused on how they're going to take their classes and interact at Dysart. Because one of the historical things at Dysart is my grandfather, Bill Bartles, every year took his science methods course out there, and people still stop me and tell me, I remember when your grandfather took his science methods course out there. So for our education students, we're working on that type of long-term excitement because we hope they leave with a relationship with Captina and will then take their local classes out there.
I was a student of your grandfather, and we did walk the Dysart Woods, and that was in the 60s. I was there 66 and 67, so I can't tell, at that point what it was. But he remained a wonderful person. He always remembered every student I think he ever had.
Well, that
Years
means
later.
that means so much to hear, because sincerely, I mean this sincerely, the work I do with my students is really inspired by that. How many folks along the years leading up to when I got involved with Dysart again told me that story, and I started telling that to Ellie and Marshall at Captina, and we started to think about how that could be an important piece to really engaging younger generations of the community. Because for a place like this to continue, you have to have that cross-generation engagement. So that means a lot that you shared that.
Hi, my question is, you mentioned that the trails were very well maintained. Who are the people that maintain them? I took my Girl Scout troop out there last fall, and I'd like to be able to take them again.
So,
Thank you.
and I want to say, feel free for me to make this connection easy for you to also just email me, and I will help loop that. So Captina Conservancy out of Barnesville, Ohio, is now the stewards of Dysart Woods. They're phenomenal, and I want to put a plug. Marshall Dyer, the land conservation manager, would likely be very willing to come and work with your Girl Scout troop. Marshall's out at Dysart multiple days a week. Marshall's buddies with my son, Liam. He spent a lot of time on the trails with us out there. And I'm happy to make that connection and also send Marshall a text and say, hey, you're going to hear from so-and-so. But I'd really encourage you to think about getting them to come out with you, because they get really excited to work with kids.
Any other questions? Okay. I'm coming.
I had a question of the funding. Okay, yeah, where's the funding? Is it state, local? Captina has fundraising.
So you know the initial story that I told about how Dysart Woods came to be. After that time, when OU took over stewardship, they started something called the Dysart Woods Fund, and that became part of the fund for every year trail maintenance, things like that. There are a number of, in the archives, you'll see not only the donation chains over the years, but also different research funding that happened there. When you fast forward to Captina, that was Ellie's biggest worry, and I'm not putting words into her mouth. She shared this with my students last week, that her big worry was, we have to have a fund ongoing to maintain this after we take it over, or we could run into similar problems. Yes, OU's problem came from disruptions in 2021 that the world couldn't see, but you can still plan. And so what they did is they wrote a grant through the state of Ohio. I believe it was one of the Clean Ohio grants. And the way it worked was, and this is how a partnership should work with a university, you write the grant, and they purchased the land off of OU, but OU donated all but a small percentage of that back, and then Ellie used that as her fund to start and build for continued management. So that is the fund that started to create that healthy funding directly related to Dysart. And now I'm going to put a plug, I'm going to put a PR plug. There are also other ways, if you're inspired to contribute, which is through Captina's different events. For example, they have their Duck Dash this weekend. And so when you contribute to things like that, you're also contributing back to that fund, but they do have a fund set aside just for Dysart. And then just to make visible the work with my students, we use that. I direct a fellowship and a few other pieces at OU where I have research grants. And so the work with my students, we fund through that, where we can give Captina honorariums, where we can pay for my students' travel. If I have students interning, I can pay for their intern time. So those smaller pieces is a way we can contribute at OU in a smaller way.
Anybody else?
Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
My little guy is in the back of the room. He's 6 years old. And everything I just shared with you is possible because he comes along with me for the ride as my first and best research assistant. So future Bobcat back there. Thank you all.